Edgar Allan Poe sat in his study, trying to come up with a new story to write. Outside it was dark with a blustering snowstorm rolling in. Typically, this was ideal writing conditions for the dark and mysterious writer. However, he had been feeling uninspired lately, and his writing had suffered as a result. He was lost in thought when he heard a loud banging at the door. He got up from his desk and opened the door to find a disheveled man standing there. It was his neighbor, Mr. Willoughby.
"Please, sir,"
Willoughby said.
"you have to help me. My wife is very sick, and I don't know what to do."
Poe's inner alarm bell began to chime, sounding like a fast heartbeat coming from somewhere deep inside the darkness of him. There had been whispers around the town of late. Whispers of something dark. Something twisted. Whispers of revenants. Poe was hesitant to help the man, but something in his eyes made him feel sympathetic.
"What's wrong with her?"
Poe asked.
"She's been acting strange. She doesn't seem like herself. And she keeps saying she's hungry, but she won't eat anything."
Again Poe was fearful. Willoughby's claims were precisely the same as the quietly creeping rumors about the region. Individuals who become very ill. So ill that they perish. But then, seemingly under the power of the very devil himself, they return against all odds, only to pass on their dastardly affliction to others. Poe had yet to witness the phenomenon himself, so he'd merely brushed it all off as idle gossip. However, seeing Willoughby's distress on this dark and stormy night certainly gave him pause.
"I'll come with you,"
Poe said.
"but we have to be careful."
The neighbor led Poe to his home, which was but a few doors down the way from Poe's. As they approached the house, Poe could hear strange noises coming from inside. Willoughby opened the door, and Poe could see poor Mrs. Willoughby lying on the couch. She looked pale and weak, flickering shadows from the candles crossing her gaunt face, and her eyes were glazed over. Poe approached her cautiously.
"What's your name?"
He asked. He fully well knew her name to be Hilary Willoughby. But did she know? The woman didn't answer. Instead, she lunged at Poe, trying to bite him. He reared back, managing to dodge her, but he realized that she was beyond saving. She was already one of the, dare he say it? Undead. A revenant. He looked at Willoughby, searching for any indication that the dear fellow understood what had begotten his poorly wife. Poe turned to the man.
"I'm sorry, but there's nothing we can do for her."
The man broke down in tears.
"What am I going to do?"
He asked. Poe thought for a moment.
"There's only one thing we can do. We have to get out of here before she comes after us."
There were other things that could be done, according to the rumors. But Poe was surely not willing to be the one to end this revenant's misery. He knew he could never bring himself to do such a ghastly thing. They quickly gathered their wits about them and left the house, stealing into the night. The air swirled with thick, heavy snow by then. As they were walking down the street, they saw more and more revenants. It was clear that the infection had spread beyond just one person. The nightmare was no longer a rumor born of the overactive imaginations of bored ladies at the house. It was real. Poe knew that they had to find a safe place to hide. He remembered a story he had heard about a crypt in the cemetery that was said to be impregnable. He led Willoughby there, and they managed to get inside just before the revenants caught up to them. The crypt was dark and musty, but it was safe. Poe and the man sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the revenants outside. Poe knew that they couldn't stay there forever, but he didn't know what their next move should be. He produced a match from his coat pocket and lit a lone lamp on the crypt wall. As they sat in the crypt, Poe began to feel inspired. He realized that this was the perfect setting for a story. He pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. Willoughby glared at Poe, aghast.
"Do you believe this to be the appropriate time for your scribbles, Poe?"
He demanded. Poe gave him a sheepish look.
Apologies, Willoughby, but it's important to strike whilst the iron is hot.
He wrote about Willoughby and his wife, and how they had been caught in the middle of a revenant outbreak. He wrote about their struggles to survive, and the sacrifices they had to make in order to stay alive. He wrote about the fear and the desperation that they felt, and the hope that they clung to. As he wrote, Poe felt his creativity returning. He felt like he was back in his element, and he knew that he had a masterpiece on his hands. When he finished writing, he looked up to find that Willoughby had long since fallen asleep and morning had risen outside the crypt. Poe smiled, knowing that he had given the man a brief respite from the horrors of the world outside, and now the groans of the swarming revenants had gone. Poe didn't know how long they stayed in the crypt, but eventually, they knew they had to leave. They ventured outside cautiously, Poe clutching his work of genius to his chest, and to their surprise, they found that the revenants had disappeared. They walked around the city, trying to make sense of what had happened. It was as if the revenants had never existed in the first place. Poe couldn't explain it, but he knew that it was a miracle. As they walked, they came across a group of survivors. They had managed to band together and fight off the revenants, who mostly prowled at night. Poe and Willoughby joined the group, and together they worked to rebuild their community. As time passed and the community continued to thrive, Poe became obsessed with understanding the origins of the revenant outbreak. He knew that there had to be an explanation for what had happened, and he was determined to find it. He spent countless hours poring over old books and manuscripts, trying to find any clue that could help him solve the mystery. And finally, he found it. It turned out that the revenant outbreak had been caused by a rare virus that was discovered by a group of scientists who were conducting research in the nearby mountains. They had been studying the virus, hoping to find a cure for a deadly disease that was plaguing the region. But something had gone terribly wrong. One of the scientists had accidentally contaminated the virus with a strain of rabies, and the virus had mutated into something far more dangerous. The virus had spread quickly, infecting everyone who came into contact with it. And as people succumbed to the virus, they became the undead, driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Poe was horrified by what he had learned, but he was also relieved. He knew that the revenant outbreak had not been caused by some supernatural force, but by a scientific experiment gone wrong. He wrote about the virus in great detail, hoping that his words would serve as a warning to future generations. And as he looked out over the community that he had helped to build, he knew that his words had the power to change the world. Poe continued to write, and his story about the revenant outbreak and his old pal, Willoughby, became a bestseller. It was hailed as a masterpiece, and it helped to cement his place in literary history. Years later, when Poe was an old man, he would tell the story of the revenant outbreak to his grandchildren. They would listen in awe as he described the horrors that he had seen, and they would marvel at his bravery. In the end, Poe knew that the revenant outbreak had changed him. It had given him a new appreciation for life, and it had reminded him that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope. But as Poe grew older, his health began to decline. He was plagued by a mysterious illness that doctors could not cure. Eventually, Poe succumbed to the illness and passed away. His old friend Willoughby and his own wife had long since died, and only the townsfolk and the world of book lovers were left to mourn him. The community was devastated by the loss of their beloved writer, but their grief was short-lived. Within a few days, something strange began to happen. The ground above Poe's grave began to shift and groan, and soon a revenant emerged from the earth. The community was horrified by the sight of Poe, now a revenant, stumbling through the streets. But they soon realized that something miraculous had happened. Poe, even as a revenant, retained his intelligence and his ability to write. Perhaps it was his years of deep study and understanding of the virus, along with his passion for ink and quill, that left him with the ability to crave creativity along with the longing to feast upon human flesh. The community rallied together and built a little crypt with windows to keep Poe in, where people could come visit and talk to him. He, of course, could not carry on a real conversation with them. He usually only gnashed his teeth and raged against the window panes, or he sat at his wooden writing desk, scrawling away at one macabre story after another, altogether unaware of his fans surrounding the crypt. At first, it was a shock to see their hero as a revenant, but over time, people grew to accept it. Poe spent his days writing, and people would come from far and wide to see him. They would sit in front of the windows of the crypt, lovingly watching as Poe scribbled away at his papers. In the end, Poe's revenant state became something of a novelty. People would bring their friends and family to see him, and they would take pictures and laugh at the absurdity of it all. To this very day, he remains in a little-known cemetery in a little-known burg right outside of Boston, Mass. And so, Edgar Allan Poe, the master of horror, became a revenant, and even in death, he continued to inspire and entertain.